Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Usually people are supposed to answer back, at least in the South.
Only in the South. In the South, you gotta respond.
And welcome to all of you for coming to this panel on the future of the African American past. That title, I think, nicely frames our task this afternoon, which, as I understand it, is to deploy the past toward building toward an agenda for the study of and dissemination of African American history. The immediate occasion for this panel is the imminent opening of the Museum of African American History on the National Mall in Washington, which I understand is sometime perhaps toward the late end of September of this year. And in some sense, this session is a kind of jumpstart to a three-day conference in Washington in May of this year that will precede that opening in the fall. But in a more profound, perhaps unanticipated sense, this session falls squarely in a crisis-induced national moment of reflection on the past, present, and future of efforts to understand Black Americans' historical experience and how that history might inform our present. Our inquiry is in some sense then overdetermined, not only by the current events in places like Ferguson, Charleston, Chicago, and others, but by the tyranny of the calendar, since these deliberations fall in the midst of the anniversaries of some of the seminal moments in the history of Black folk in America. 2 years ago was the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Last year saw a similar sesquicentennial marking the end of the Civil War and the constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. And those events were coupled with the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which culminated, in some sense, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This year and next, we will have occasion to recall or recollect both the promise and violence of Black life after slavery, both its achievements and its betrayals. What I hope this session might bring to our attention as we reflect on these national landmarks is that roughly 50 years ago, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, the nation witnessed a powerful insurgency on the campuses of its colleges, its universities, and in a few cases, its high schools, all across the country, demanding a radically new engagement with how the Black experience was written about in books, taught in schools, and portrayed in public media. Ironically, indeed poignantly, the energy and fierceness of that challenge was a measure of the faith and that how our past is remembered matters, that our history is not a disinterested discipline, but it can be, and it cannot be left only to academics. Roughly 15 years later, a conference motivated much like this session was convened at Purdue University at the initiative of Darlene Clark Hine with the assistance of Harold Woodman, her colleague there, and under the sponsorship and with the imprimatur of the AHA, to address the very issues we are charged with considering today. From whence have we come? That is the intellectual and research directions of the field, and whither are we headed? Now, I will not take time to detail the findings of that conference, but I would urge you to read John Hope Franklin's address, which is available in print in a book that, a collection that Darlene published after the conference, I think in 1983, by LSU Press, called The State of African American History. But I think Franklin's address, I think, resonates with our session today. Recounting the long history of the field since the late 19th century, Franklin argued that it was the task of each generation to revisit the larger premises of our intellectual work in the light of the demands of our own historical moment. The audience to which Franklin spoke was made up largely of what I have called elsewhere the civil rights generation, former campus rebels, just then ready to enter into the ranks of what the right wing would come to call tenured radicals. Today, some 37 years later, most of us might be more accurately characterized as superannuated radicals. But time, I believe, has not dulled Franklin's sharp challenge that evening at Purdue 32 years ago. The temper of our own times suggests that his charge was never more resonant than now. Fortunately, we have an impressive panel of scholars to help us reframe that charge in terms more pertinent to our present historical moment, within and outside the university. I will introduce them now, and they will each speak in the order of their introduction. David Blight is the class of 1954 professor of American history at Yale University, and currently the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, which is not bad for a lad born and reared in Flint, Michigan, a town that UAW workers and Michael Moore made famous.
No, we can't drink the water. No.
Luckily, you escaped before that, I guess. On the academic side, David had a long list of publications that I will not take time to read, except to mention or to plug my favorite, Race and Reunion, a book whose highly nuanced examination of how the Civil War has been remembered and memorialized, has thereby shaped public perceptions and public policy well into the 20th century, and perhaps arguably to this day, given some of the activities of Southern legislatures with respect to school textbooks. David has contributed a chapter on the period from West Africa to emancipation to the new museum volume that will accompany its exhibits, entitled, I believe, To Dream a World Anew. But perhaps the most intriguing tidbit I found out about David's background is that after earning his BA, he taught in a public high school for 7 years. Don't know whether that was in Flint or not, but it certainly is very relevant to our task today. Janetta Cole brings to this conversation the insights of an anthropologist as well as that of one who has served as a museum director and a college president. Educated at Fisk, Oberlin, and Northwestern, from which she received her PhD in anthropology, she did field research in Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. Following a distinguished teaching career at Emory, where she was a professor of anthropology, women's studies, and African American studies, she was appointed president of Spelman College, the first black woman to head that storied institution. From 2002 to 2007, she occupied the same position at Bennett College, another historically black women's college. And in 2009, Janetta was appointed to her current position, director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art, whose stated mission is to, quote, inspire conversations about the beauty, power, and diversity of African art and cultures worldwide, unquote. Given our conversation today, however, it is noteworthy, I think, that in addition to her rich teaching and administrative experiences, Janetta Cole was among the earliest pioneers of Black Studies, having been the founding director of the program at Washington State University in Pullman in 1969-70, which, if you know your history of Black Studies, was a year of wonders, as they say. Annette Gordon-Reed has expertise in both history and law, which imposes on her the double burden of having 2 extra names laid on top of her professorial rank at Harvard as Harvard's history department. The Carol, if I pronounce this correctly, Forsheimer Professor at Radcliffe Institute, and the Charles Warren Professor of Legal History at the Harvard Law School. Fortunately, the Harmsworth Visiting Professorship at Oxford only lasted 1 year, a tremendous savings on her stationery bill, I expect. Annette's CV reveals a lengthy list of awards and fellowships, including most notably perhaps the Guggenheim and MacArthur Fellowships, and the 2009 Pulitzer Prize in History for her magnificent The Hemmingses of Monticello, An American Family, a book that transformed scholarship not only on the most prominent of America's founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, but on race and slavery in America's colonial and early national eras more generally. And I might add, to my pleasant surprise, it is one of the few 700-plus page books that both my undergraduate and graduate students have willingly, and I might even add enthusiastically, read cover to cover. Our final speaker will not be Lonnie Bunch, the new director of the African American History Museum, despite what it says in your program. Regretfully, Lonnie was called to a higher duty, not that one, or at least we hope so. He was impaneled for jury duty in federal court in Washington, and couldn't get out of it. But we are very fortunate to have his esteemed colleague, Rex Ellis, filling in for him. Rex is the Associate Director for the Curatorial Affairs at the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, where he is responsible not only for the preservation and interpretation of documents, but the educational programs and exhibits that make them available and accessible to the public. Again, something very relevant to our discussion today. Rex brings to the Smithsonian an extensive experience and distinguished career in museum work. He was the vice president of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, in fact, the first African American to hold that post. He has authored 2 books, Beneath the Blazing Sun, Stories of the African American Journey, and With a Banjo on My Knee. In addition, I would venture to guess that he's the only one among the impressive performers on our stage this afternoon who is also a member in good standing, I hope, assume, with the Screen Actors Guild. So clearly we have a panel that is not only professionally accomplished, but offers diverse perspectives on our topic. Each of them will speak in the same order that as I've introduced them for no more than 15 minutes, I've warned them. Then we will allow a few minutes for exchanges among them, but reserve the bulk of the remaining time for comments and questions from you. So, David?
Thanks so much, Tom. Thank you all for coming. I've caught a bronchitis cold, so if I'm growling, that's the reason. And I hope the voice holds out. As all of you in this room can know and feel, who have written in this field and taught in this field all of your lives, you can't take up this subject without feeling the weight of dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have come before us. I'm not going to name a long list of them. Many of them are in the book that Tom mentioned, The State of Afro-American History, as it was referred to in the 1980s. I purchased this book when I was a graduate student trying to finish a dissertation. When it came out, I can vaguely remember how exciting it felt that this field would have such a book of essays. Tom didn't mention that he wrote the introduction to the book, which is itself a lasting, enduring essay about the nature of the African American experience within the American experience. That comes in the book before John Hope's amazing introduction about the 4 generations of historians of the Black experience. I do want to mention just one of those people on that long list, because I want to quote him. It would be Nathan Huggins, who had an impact on my life, to say the least. I wrote an essay on Nathan's life and work when he died, which Randy Burkett will remember. And I was just rummaging around to find out things about Nathan's, elusive life. And I looked him up in Who's Who, which I'm not sure most of us do anymore. I don't know. Does anybody write stuff for Who's Who? But in Nathan's Who's Who, he said this about our craft. And it's deeply relevant, I think, to any consideration about how we talk about the future of what we do. Nathan said, quote, "I find in the study of history the special discipline that forces me to consider people and ages not my own. It is the most humane of disciplines, and in ways the most humbling. For one cannot ignore those historians of the future who will look back on us in the same way." Humanity and humility. Those are two principles of our craft that we should never lose. I was an undergraduate at Michigan State in the late 60s. I took the first ever Black History course. I think it was called I'm not sure what it was called, honestly. It was taught by Leslie Rout, who some of you know was a Brazilianist. But he was a Black American, so at that time I assumed the department said, "Les, you teach it, you're Black." And he did. In his field, he wrote books about Perón and modern Brazil. But he taught it, and I suspect Les was probably boning up out of John Hope Franklin's book, 2 days before we learned it. But it was amazing. It was either 68 or 69. I don't recall, actually. But it was the first of its kind, a course at a Big Ten university, and it was a revelation. And Les was a great teacher. 2 years later, I was in a high school classroom in Flint, Michigan, drinking the water, and we were creating something called a Black History course in 1971. Most of us had no clue what we were doing. We did have John Hope Franklin's, whatever edition it was, 5th or 6th. And I remember getting the school library to order massive copies of Kenneth Stamp's Peculiar Institution, because that's the book I knew about slavery. But that's how we began teaching. And I didn't know what I was doing. Anyway, I just wanted to remember Les Rout, the late Les, who was, by the way, a great saxophonist, too. Studs Terkel interviewed James Baldwin in July 1961. As you know, Baldwin did endless interviews by the early 60s. He was the most ubiquitous speaker and voice, in some ways, nonfiction voice of the civil rights movement. But in an interview with Terkel, Baldwin was being Baldwin. He was shooting from the hip. He was answering questions before they were asked. He was being Baldwin. He was ranting on about how Americans don't have any sense of history. Americans don't have any sense of tragedy. And he kept stressing the term tragedy. And Terkel, in the interview, kind of settles him down at one point and says, "Mr. Baldwin, what do you mean by a sense of history?" And Baldwin pauses at least briefly, and then he said, "Well, you read something that you thought only happened to you, and you discovered it happened 100 years ago to Dostoevsky. This is a great liberation for the suffering, struggling person who always thinks he is alone." I've always loved that answer, especially for young people. What does it mean to have a sense of history? It means you're not alone. And then Terkel asked him, "But what do you mean by a sense of tragedy? You keep ranting on about that, but what do you mean?" Baldwin's answer: "People think that a sense of tragedy is a kind of embroidery, something irrelevant that you can take or leave. But in fact, it is a necessity. That's what the blues and the spirituals are all about. It is the ability to look on things as they are and survive your losses, or even not survive them. To know that your losses are coming. To know they are coming is the only possible insurance you have, a faint insurance, that you will survive them." That's a tough definition of tragedy. And Baldwin, those of you who've read Baldwin know, especially his nonfiction, he used the term tragedy all the time in his writing. He wasn't afraid of the word like most Americans are. And I guess it's the theme I want to stress today. African American history has never been a story for the faint-hearted, nor for those who seek a past that will merely please or entertain, although it may do both of those. The African American past comes to us laden with both enlightenment and terror, riddled with equal parts of slavery and freedom, racism and humanity, unspeakable oppression and unfathomable courage, guilt and responsibility, travail and triumph, resistance and victimization, that paradigm we still struggle, I think, to get out of at times. It was created by human beings who died for the American flag, and by those who fought against every vestige of American hypocrisy, in season and out. It's a turbulent, fascinating history that arrives in all shades of color, and it was made by all manner of heroes and villains. It is a history like all others, as Baldwin might insist, of enormous and recurring loss, but also of victories. 6 months after he gave that interview with Studs Terkel, Baldwin wrote a short piece in the New York Times entitled, "As Much Truth as One Can Bear." That was his title. He lamented in the piece that Americans reflect on their history, he said, too often, in his words, too often when they use words, the quote is, he said, Americans reflect on their history too often by using words mostly used to cover up the sleeper, but never to wake him up. Cover the sleeper, never wake him up. The African American past, we might like to think, should always awaken the sleeper. But nobody likes nightmares. To generalize, Americans broadly have long embraced master narratives of our history that help us sleep at night. Stories of enlightened founders and intrepid, even if flawed, inheritors. We like to celebrate rebels as well as preservers. We generally prefer the stories of the many thousand born and survived to the many thousand gone, nameless or lost. We, and that's of course a very elusive pronoun anymore in America, maybe it's always been. We want our children to learn and find a usable past they can believe in. And on this count, African Americans, including those who write, read, and publish this complex history, have been, by and large, no different than other groups. This is especially true of the issue of slavery, a field I work in the infinitely expansive worlds of public history, which is the essential reason we're here because of the opening of the great new museum. Some dozen years ago or so, I was part of a group of historians involved in advising the creators of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, which some of you I'm sure have visited. At some of our consultation gatherings, we used to meet with the museum's Board of Trustees. On one Saturday, each of us historians was put at a table with 6 or 8 members of their board. My table included famous civil rights lawyers, I won't name any of them except one, distinguished artists, the architect of the museum building itself, a corporate CEO, a school superintendent, and others, all but one, if I can recollect correctly, who were African American. My job was to get them all talking in a kind of seminar for at least 2 hours about why this history of slavery and the Underground Railroad and abolition needed to be told and represented in a great public museum, how the stories of slavery and anti-slavery might be presented to the public. To a person, with one exception, my seminar mates all advocated for a progressive story. Understandably, a story that would uplift young people and in the end leave families, and this is the way many of them put it, leave families feeling pride and hope as they exited the museum experience. Uplift my children is what they were saying. Got it, okay. Over probably an hour and a half of this discussion, only one person at the table had not spoken. So playing teacher, with probably my knees knocking, I called on him and asked, what did he think? It was none other than the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Baptist minister, former leader of the SCLC, the epic civil rights campaign against Jim Crow in Birmingham. Shuttlesworth had risked his life, of course, countless times in the struggles of the 60s. He knew something about fashioning hope in the face of terror. We looked at the now retired minister as he broke his silence with a certain sagacious anger. If you don't tell it like it was, he said, it can never be as it ought to be. And I remember asking him to repeat that. If you don't tell it like it was, it can never be as it ought to be. And I remember being saved by the bell because whoever was leading this gathering announced it was time for lunch. And we didn't have to discuss what the Reverend had just said. But Reverend Shuttlesworth had frankly given a keynote to the entire session and a not-so-gentle chastisement to his colleagues. As hard as it is to do in the public museum, he had poignantly described the path ahead. This problem of the slave past in particular as burden, as potential shame, as the story to hurry beyond to more successful, triumphal, modern, contemporary times has perhaps always been thus in American and particularly African American life. Frederick Douglass would often describe American statute books as what he called every page red with the blood of the American slave, and the country's history something to be, as he used to put it, traced like the track of a wounded man through the crowd by the blood. But the same Douglass would also admit, especially about his own extended family, that a healthy level of human forgetting was what he called nature's plan of relief. Sometimes he acknowledged his own personal memory of slavery, which he revisited and retold over and over as his reason to be, might have been best left sleeping like, as he once put it, a half-forgotten dream. But this was not a luxury or a choice he believed blacks generally could ever afford, although in telling about his family and his own personal life, he left most of that sleeping, as many of you know. Where, though, in the post-Reconstruction United States, in a city or a sharecropper's shack, even for those attending schools, where did most African Americans in the late 19th century look for a safe haven in the past? In what narrative did they root their fragile citizenship? What American history could they safely own? How might they come to love history, as so many of us say today? Well, some did. And got it? I got 1 minute left, which means you break from script. Where have African Americans of any generation, starting with the post-freedom generation, looked in the past for that narrative that makes them safe, that makes them feel good, that sets up their children to feel good walking out the back of the museum? This is the great challenge that this great new museum that Rex, Lonnie, and so many others are creating. This is their great task. I want to suggest, as I've tried to say here, that without this sense of the tragic, as Baldwin expressed it, a sense of the tragic that says that history is not about the dark side, it's not about pessimism. Real tragedy is not pessimistic. Real tragedy is what makes real hope possible. A real sense of tragedy is what makes real hope possible. Now, the future of this museum and the future of this field, of course, involves so many things that most of us can't even know. And I brought my own list of the possibilities of what the museum can do, but I think I will save that for Q&A. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I very much appreciate this opportunity to participate on a panel on the future of the African American past. As I look to my left at this extraordinary group of distinguished scholars, I'm feeling pretty good, because I'm remembering one of the fundamental lessons my mom taught me. She said, "A woman will be known by the company she keeps." And I would say I'm in pretty high cotton. There are three sets of experiences that I will draw on in making my brief remarks. First, the academic fields in which I was trained and practiced: cultural anthropology, women's studies, and African American studies. And then there is the world of museums, in which I am currently working as the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art. And then finally, I will speak from the ongoing experience of serving as a member of the Scholarly Advisory Committee for our new museum. It is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But my work in these three arenas is always informed by my own ongoing struggles against racial, gender, and all other systems of inequality. Now, while history as a discipline and the work of historians goes on, there's also such a fundamental way in which that work needs to be understood in the everyday lives of all people, people across this world of ours. This point is captured in a particular Adinkra symbol of the Akan people of Ghana in West Africa. As many of you know, Adinkras represent concepts or aphorisms that are used to teach and to inspire people in a community. The particular Adinkra I want to lift up here is, of course, Sankofa. It is represented by a bird with a very long neck. And as the bird looks back over its own body, the message is delivered, looking back in order to go forward. In the African American community where I grew up, in those incredibly despicable days of legal segregation, I heard this aphorism repeatedly because the old folks would keep on saying, "You can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been." When the National Museum of African American History and Culture opens in the fall of 2016, and opens on the last available space on the National Mall in Washington, be assured that from within that majestic structure, and through extensive outreach and the use of technology, we will finally have a national museum that will contribute mightily to an understanding of where we are going as a nation, through an understanding of where we have been. Where we have been as reflected in the history and culture of African American people. Dr. Lonnie Bunch, the founding director of this new museum that we have waited for so long, Lonnie says that this new museum will tell America's story as seen through the lenses of African American history and culture. Dr. Bunch also reminds us that our new Museum of African American History and Culture has the awesome possibility to serve as an educational opportunity to engage millions of Americans and people from around the world to speak about issues of race. Indeed, NAMOC, we need to start learning the acronym for our new museum. NAMOC will be both a producer and an outlet for critical conversations, difficult dialogues about subjects that we as Americans continue to avoid. Of course, I speak of enslavement and the ongoing oppression of African American people. I've been very privileged to serve on the scholarly advisory committee that is charged with helping Lonnie Bunch, Rex Ellis, and other colleagues to shape the intellectual agenda of this new museum. When this scholarly advisory committee was launched in 2005, the incomparable, the beloved historian, Dr. John Hope Franklin, served as the chair of this group of scholars, artists, writers, and activists. And he led our committee until he passed in 2009 at the age of 94. And until yet another historian passed in 2014, our committee benefited from the immensely brilliant mind and beautiful soul of Professor Clement A. Price. Our scholarly advisory committee has consistently challenged the new museum's curators, educators, all of the colleagues there, to determine how they can most effectively present the diverse and complex experiences of African Americans, our history and her story, our trials and tribulations and our triumphs over time. But we've also, in a really, I would say, spiritual way of relating scholarly advisory committee to the colleagues in the museum, we have called upon them to wrestle with how they can effectively speak to issues that reflect the current realities of Black folks. Here are just a few of the questions that we have encouraged our colleagues to consider. Do many African Americans see themselves and wish to be seen these days in terms of their multiple identities, in terms of what we in scholarly speak call intersectionality? Intersectionality of their race, gender, sexual orientation, class, religion, age, emotional and physical abilities or disabilities? Or are most African Americans still deeply rooted in being, at least for my generation, what we used to refer to as race men and race women? In what ways is the Black Lives Matter movement a continuation of or a divergence from the civil rights and Black power movements of the 60s and 70s? What are the ways in which the ongoing liberation struggles of African Americans are reflected in and influenced by the struggles of other people of color? How is organized religion, which has been so central in the lives of so many Black Americans, being viewed, practiced, and not practiced today? What in the world is Black feminism? In what ways are African American millennials rethinking how their elders think about what it means to be Black in America? In what ways does the rapidity and pervasiveness of modern technology highlight similarities and differences among various communities of Black folks on the African continent and throughout the diaspora? Why is poverty so incredibly persistent in the lives of so many African Americans? None of these, of course, are easy questions for our colleagues to raise, let alone to respond to, especially because they are doing so within the medium of what we think we know to be a museum. And yet, the exhibitions that are being planned, the educational programs that are being designed, the kind of outreach into local, national, and international communities that is being envisioned will indeed wrestle with these contemporary manifestations of long-standing realities among those of us that W.E. Du Bois referred to as the people of the darker hue. Let me bring closure on these remarks by reaffirming once again that no people, no nation can know where they are going until they not only know, but own where they have been. How amazing it is. How amazing and full of grace that we will finally have a museum that will help us better understand where all Americans are going, because we will own up to where African Americans have begun and continue to be. Thank you.
It's very, very good to be here with you today. I would say that any moment or any time period would be a wonderful time to open an African American museum. History Museum. It's long overdue, and I'm glad to see that we're going to be doing it. But I think that this is a particularly great moment to be doing it, an interesting moment to do it, a time which I'm on the Dartmouth Board of Trustees, and I'm with a lot of corporate types, and they use the term inflection point to describe a moment when things change, a particular moment when you go through a different path. And I think that we might be at an inflection point in discussions of African American history and African American present. Certainly this moment that we've been in, at least for me, started with the Trayvon Martin issue, exacerbated, it sort of sped up with Ferguson. Certainly the events in Charleston helped things along. And people began to think as they saw videos of black people being killed by police officers, visible evidence of black second-class citizenship, the kinds of things that blacks have been saying for years actually became known, seeable to other people, out there in the public for everyone to see. And that has changed the game, I think, for a number of people, particularly young black Americans, who are in a moment, I would say, of something of an existential crisis about this situation. On college campuses, people who feel that something should be done are looking at their own campuses, college campuses, to make complaints about symbols that they find offensive, about treatment that they find offensive. That's always been there, but this is a real moment. Things are roiling up. I'm involved in 2 campuses, Dartmouth and Harvard, and every day I get an email about some other crisis or some of us sort of dealing with particular issues that are going on in campus as students begin to grapple with this. And I've been asked to comment on these circumstances for the past couple of years by media outlets and other places. And one of the things that I've said is that all of these moments have sort of brought to the fore the question of African American citizenship. What level of citizenship do we have? And why was Ferguson like it was, like it is? How did they happen to come to this particular point? And Missouri is, I thought, a sort of perfect place to have these issues come to head, because it's always been a part of a sort of symbolized or sort of related to crises in the history of race in America. Certainly the Missouri Compromise, I should say the crisis in 1819, 1821, when the Union almost came apart, when people saw that sectional crisis over the institution of slavery might split the Union. Later on, with the Dred Scott decision on the question of black citizenship, it's sort of fitting at this particular place that things would come to a head, and Trayvon Martin brought people together and brought a critique, but Ferguson brought people from other places to Ferguson to actually protest what was going on there, and started a movement, Black Lives Matter, that was alluded to earlier, that sort of changed the focus, or sort of brought to head some of the concerns about the direction of American life. And I think that this is wonderful for the museum, because many of the people who are focusing on that will be the people who will come to the museum and make suggestions about the museum, and will hope to see some of what their critique of American society and what is put there, hope and tragedy, as David mentioned before, but a realistic assessment of where we have been and where we're going. The question of citizenship that's raised by all of these issues, the continuing legacy of white supremacy that has influenced black lives, the notion of the sort of economic deprivation of the African American community that is a legacy of slavery, a legacy of political second-class citizenship and economic second-class citizenship. All of these things are there and are on the minds of people, young people, who are struggling to try to figure out where we fit. And so a museum that engages these kinds of questions, that talks about our past, is, I think, especially fitting for them and for us as well. Whatever we think about some of the things that students have called for example, there's been a lot of ridicule of this notion of safe spaces, wanting to be comfortable in places, and some of it might be subject to criticism or whatever, but it basically, I think, is a part of this this notion that black people, that young people, young black people, whether they think of themselves as race men or not, or race women or not, definitely have the sense that they belong in the United States. I see that, and the call for the removal of symbols, the call for safe spaces, a call for sensitivity training, some of the things that people have pushed back against, talking about the First Amendment and so forth, is really just a statement, a sort of a cri de coeur about second-class citizenship and people not wanting to take that for granted, young people not being willing to take that for granted. My own thoughts about it, it's very difficult for me as a historian to think about, I guess the phrase people use, erasing symbols is not necessarily erasing symbols, but removing symbols, is that I think that people learn from those kinds of things. At the same time, I understand that if you are a citizen, if you are to be comfortable in a particular place, your surrounding must respect you in ways. And some symbols are so abhorrent, are so problematic, that it's difficult to achieve this sense of comfort, this sense of belonging, which is what I think young people today are looking for with those symbols in place. So it's a difficult line drawing function, and people have asked me about typical various symbols, which one should stay and which one should go. But I think having the conversation itself is something that, you know, people have tried to have it with the Confederate flag for a very, very long time, but the notion now that we should move beyond even the things that are most obviously problematic to everyday things that people took for granted that are not, you know, sort of blatantly insulting, but things that are problematic, I think is a healthy sign, even though it's exasperating to many people. This is a group of folks who feel that they have arrived and that they deserve to have first-class citizenship, and that the surroundings, that if you bring people to a place, they should be comfortable there. So all of these things have sort of taken place in the last 2 or 3 years that sort of touched off this inflection point where you have young people who are leading in their own way, leading a particular struggle, a particular battle for inclusion in the United States, and against white supremacy and against, I guess, the phrase that they use, privilege, is something that's heartening, and it's something that I think the museum, I hope, will attempt to capitalize upon, to bring these people in as well, to talk about the exhibits, to be a part of things, to sort of give their viewpoints on it as well, to sort of keep this movement alive. One of the things that is so amazing, it's wonderful, and I guess it's useful about African American history, is that the past never really goes away. I mean, the good part of it, the strength that we draw from ancestors, from people who went before us, who struggled for us, people who were race men and race women who thought that their survival would mean something for the future generations, that stays with us. The bad side, of course, is white supremacy. The white supremacy that was created by and fueled by slavery and kept in place after Reconstruction, after Jim Crow. The institution of Jim Crow is still with us today, and that legacy influences things to a degree that lots of people just many people don't think of. I think of the events out in Oregon today, and what does that have to do with all of this? The notion of a group of people, armed people, taking over a federal installation and being treated with dignity and courtesy by law enforcement officials, something that should happen to all people, but does not happen too often in African American communities. People have said many, many times, sort of imagining what would happen if a group of black citizens took over a federal installation for a protest. What would happen? Most people think that they would not be treated the same way, that people who were called, I should reflect on that for a moment, a militia. I don't know that gatherings of black people, black men, are ever given the status of militia, which is an incident of Republican citizenship. Militia, that term. So it's a term almost of honor in a way. It has a negative connotation. You think of, black helicopters and survivalists and so forth, but the militia was supposedly, in the founding terms, is a group of citizens who are exercising their rights, who are supposed to be protecting the community. They're given this title, but it's hard to think of African Americans being given that title similarly, who were in a situation like that. So these kinds of things, the proliferation of media that has made these kinds of events public, that people make these kinds of comparisons, Black Lives Matter, Twitter, all those kinds of things, help people see and comment upon the disparate treatment from Black Americans to white Americans is a part of something that starts with the legacy of slavery and is a legacy of African American history. So I am actually hopeful about the future. I must admit to sometimes to be somewhat exasperated by the impatience of young people, but I protested when I was young too. So I understand the concept of demands and all of those issues, but I am overall hopeful with the opening of a museum, the opening of people's consciousnesses, of young people's consciousness, that it's almost as if they woke up and realized that, wait a minute, we're not post-racial. Barack Obama's presidency doesn't mean that everything is okay, that all is the same, that all is well. And I am sort of enthusiastic about the energy and the passion that young people have put into keeping the connection between the African American present and the past alive, keeping it together, and providing a critique of society today that I think is something that will be hard for people to ignore, has been hard for people to ignore. So for me, it's a hopeful moment, and it's all going forward. It's all hopeful, and I hope progressive in ways that will be useful to people, whatever intersectionality is important, but it's not, I think, necessarily in opposition to the idea that the destiny of African American people is inextricably linked to its past. So with that, thank you.
I want to apologize again for Lonnie not being here. He was very distraught that he could not be here with you. He sends his deep, deep, deep regrets for not being able to join you. He's serving on a grand jury in D.C. and truly would rather be here. I want to start with a story. Many, many years ago in Angola, there lived a girl with beautiful, large eyes. Whenever she walked through the village, her gaze was more than the young men could bear. On the summer that she was to marry, a drought came upon the region. Crops dried up, the earth dried up and turned to dust, and the people began to starve. And when your mind is on food, you cannot think of marriage, even to one so beautiful as the girl with the large eyes. She had very little time to think of her own misfortune, because it was her duty each day to go to the riverbed and to scoop up what clay she could and to squeeze what water she could from the clay. One day she goes to the riverbed, she scoops up the clay, she begins to squeeze the water from the clay, and a fish appears. And he says to her, "Give me your pitcher." She obeys, and he fills it with cool, clear water. The next day, the girl returned to the riverbed, and she called to the fish, and the fish appears, and he says to her, "Give me your pitcher." She obeys. He fills it with cool, clear water. Each day, the girl returned to the riverbed. Each day, she called to the fish. Each day, he filled her pitcher with cool, clear water. And the girl became very fond of the fish. His eyes were clear, like the water he provided for her each day. His skin was the color of the rainbow. And on the seventh day, she allowed him to embrace her, and she became his wife. Now, the father of the girl with the large eyes became very curious as to where she was getting this water from each day. He was a medicine man. He turns his son, her brother, into a fly. He says, "Follow her. Report back to me." The next morning, the brother, the fly, accompanies the girl with the large eyes to the riverbed, and he watches in amazement as she calls to the fish. He watches in amazement as she allows the fish to embrace her. He flies home to tell his father of this disgraceful occurrence. The next morning, the father will not allow the girl with the large eyes to go to the riverbed. Instead, he and his son go to the riverbed, and when they arrive, they call to the fish, and when he appears, they kill him. They pick up the fish, they take it back to the girl with the large eyes, and they lay it at her feet, and they say to her, "We have bought you your husband." She looks down at the fish, eyes grown cloudy, skin no longer the color of the rainbow, and her eyes began to fill with tears. She picked up the fish and she begins to walk. She walks and she walks until she comes to a cool, clear stream. Calling her husband's name, she walked into the water until it covered her head. But before she died, she gave birth to many, many children. And they can be seen on the beds of the river today as water lilies. Now, what does a story about some African girl with big eyes and a fish that spits water, takes the girl as his wife, and then has baby flowers have to do with the National Museum of African American History and Culture? Well, like our museum, even though we have an impressive design and are located at a prominent place on the National Mall, there is more to us than meets the eye. If you explore that story a bit deeper, you will find that this is a story about cleansing, it's a story about magic, it's a story about faith, it's a story about beauty, and in particular, a story about resilience and transformation. Of greatest importance is that the girl saw something in the fish that her father refused to see. The girl represents one generation and the father another, one perspective fueled by hate and another fueled by love. Sadly, in the end, the girl dies, but the love she had for the fish was a love that challenged and ultimately triumphed over hate and his bigotry. And the girl's reward for her enlightened perspective was transformative and yielded one of nature's most beautiful flowers, the water lily. Like the transformation experience of the girl, my boss, Lonnie Bunch, has been consistent about his desire for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He wants our visitors' experience to also be transformative. Our vision has 4 guiding principles. To be a place of collaboration is the first. As an example, we are exploring partnerships with like-minded organizations that are producing significant work in the field of history and culture, such as the Association of African American Museums, the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. We will also look to centers of higher education, such as Hampton University, Howard University, the University of Maryland, Princeton Theological Seminary, Harvard, Stanford, Yale. We are convinced that the National Museum of African American History and Culture is in a unique position to discover, to preserve, and to share the contributions that existing organizations have made to American history. Second, We want to revel in and celebrate African American history, from the joy and pride of Muhammad Ali standing victorious after the Thriller in Manila, or Althea Gibson winning 11 Grand Slam tournaments, or better yet, Marian Anderson singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939 after being turned away by the Daughters of the American Revolution. There is much to remember, much to celebrate. Third, we want to centralize the African American experience in a way that acknowledges its global reach. We need to remember that it was the anthem of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome," that was being sung by Lech Walesa in Poland, in South Africa, by South Africans in Lusaka, Zambia, by Chinese students in Tiananmen Square, by John Hume. That name sound familiar? Every year at his Parties Conference in Northern Ireland. Finally, we believe that the 4 or 5 million people who will visit the museum on the National Mall, and the 80 million who will be a part of visiting us online, is simply an amazing opportunity to educate and suggest that African American history is quintessentially American history. Being a part of the Smithsonian will motivate many and engage millions, we think, who may not explore their race at home in their own communities, but because they are at the famous Smithsonian, we hope that they will be inspired to do so while they are there visiting at the National Mall. We will not incorporate scholarship from the Academy only, but we will also produce our own scholarship. Finally, we acquire objects that will help us reflect that scholarship that we have gotten from you, scholarship that we have produced ourselves, will also be a part of a whole huge, now over 35,000 objects that we have collected at the museum. We will teach about Robert Abbott and the Chicago Defender's printing press and other materials that will allow us to grapple with the new thinking about migration, or how we can use Nat Turner's Bible as a point of departure for discussing slavery and religion and insurrection. We'll look at musical innovation through the lens of George Clinton's Mothership, or Radio Raheem's Boombox, from Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. We plan to use the museum as a platform to help America deal with issues from the past and the present, to suggest that there is a present in the past and an optimistic future in the present. That what was and has divided us doesn't have to destroy us, and the possibility that what unites us can also inspire the best in us. Yep, we brazenly want to engage in history, art, and culture that ultimately helps make America better. We want to go beyond giving simple answers to complex questions and help our visitors embrace ambiguity as well as complexity. There's a joke I learned at Colonial Williamsburg that revolves around a question: how many Virginians does it take to change a light bulb? The answer, 3. 1 to hold the ladder, 1 to change the bulb, 1 to talk about how good the old bulb was. We see a museum that convenes, displays, encourages, and inspires conversations about the many and varied issues that face our nation, that's already been mentioned by my colleagues, especially through the lens of the African American journey. Issues like violence, race, gender, immigration, and the diaspora. It's not just the old bulb that concerns us. It is also the design, the fabrication, the reliability, and the promise of a new generation of bulbs and how we can use them to bring light into historically dark places. Some time back, my mother-in-law came to visit me at the Smithsonian. One of the watershed exhibits there at that time was called Field to Factory. It had received a number of accolades. It focused on the Great Migration, but it began by focusing on the agrarian world that existed in the postbellum South. Time straining from the failures of Reconstruction and dreams deferred sort of reflects that time in postbellum America. As she began her journey, my mother-in-law, she came upon a fenced-in area that contained farm implements. She stopped dead in her tracks, and she began talking to me about Jasper, a horse that they had when she was a girl. And she talked about how she could take grain and go out in the field and get Jasper and hook him up, and how she could plow as good as any man could plow. As she was talking about her experience in Suffolk, Virginia, others came up who were also visiting Field to Factory and began to listen to her and began to talk about their experiences that happened to be in Missouri, or their experiences that happened to be in Wisconsin, or their experiences that happened to be in Michigan and other places. And she stayed there upwards of half an hour talking and listening to strangers who unwittingly had engaged in a shared past that she never even considered. As we drove home, she looked over at me and said, "It must be nice to work at a museum where you can go every day and see yourself." We have the audacity to believe that we can do just that. Create a museum that allows us to look through the lens of African American history and see more clearly what it means to be an American. Because we believe that understanding who we are is the first step to making America better.
I thought we'd take a few minutes if the panelists might have comments, questions to each other before opening it up to a more general discussion, if that's the case. And if not, then we are in fact open to your, what's the arrangement here in terms of mics? I guess you have to speak loud, I suppose.
Shout it out.
No questions?
I very much enjoyed this panel, and I truly applaud you for the upcoming museum. I did want to ask you, though, about...
Could you each
I'm sorry,
identify
Graham
yourself?
Hodges from Colgate University.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about one of the most important publishing events this last year, and that's Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. And if you could reflect upon how this book has influenced your interpretations of the past. Could you do that?
I just taught the book in a seminar with Baldwin's Fire Next Time and many other books. Students were stunned by it, they loved it. Ta-Nehisi, I've gotten to know him pretty well too, particularly when he started blogging about my book. Anyway, we should all be so lucky. He has a huge audience. To me, one of the most remarkable things about it, I mean, I know it is about his fears for his son, but it's also about his own journey in learning history. I mean, it's a central thread of that long essay is how Ta-Nehisi leaves Howard University and starts reading a lot of the books you all wrote and found out the history of the United States and the history of slavery and the history of civil rights. It's an amazing statement about a self-taught historian and how he came to a sense of the past. To me, that was I mean, among the other powerful things about it, one of the most powerful things in it. I mean, we could debate whether he, you know, goes too far with some of his judgments or not, and my students did that. But the fact that he is kind of a self-taught reader of history shows us that that can still happen.
I think what I would say about him is that he reminds us all of the fact that there is a new generation of young people coming up, many of whom are in this audience. You talked about Ta-Nehisi. I was thinking about Adam Bradley, who did his anthology on hip hop, or Eddie Glaude, who is a wonderful scholar, African American scholar on religion, or Michael Denzel Smith, who's a writer for The Nation, or Sejifo Sekou, who writes as well for the community, and as a pastor. There's so many young people who are looking and who are challenging us in many, many ways. And it's exciting, and for us old heads, it's also kind of, how would I put it, a reminder that we need to move aside and support the new ideas and support the new scholarship and the new scholars that are out there and waiting for their opportunity to also make their mark.
I think one of the more interesting things about him, he let me do a guest blog. We were talking about Jefferson and Kosciuszko, and I took over his blog for a day or so on that question. The more interesting thing about him is that, the most interesting thing about it is he is a self-taught historian, but is coming from a different perspective, a black person who is not religious, who is not looking to a Christian tradition or a Muslim tradition or any other kind of tradition, a very secular voice, which you don't typically have in African America. I mean, it's how many times do I go to gatherings of African Americans, and it's just taken for granted that you're going to pray before it, and you don't really see that at white events. And so to have an intellectual, a black intellectual, who confronts these issues and brings all these things to the fore, who is an atheist, is quite fascinating. It's a sort of the diversity of views that a different generation of people. Although he's about 40, right? So he's not like a kid, but he's had very long. It's not a flash in the pan. I mean, he's a struggling writer, and he's been for a very, very long time. He's been at this at a time, so he's definitely paying his dues and so forth. But I think that's the more fascinating thing about him, the secular nature of him. I mean, Baldwin is different in the sense that Baldwin, whatever his ultimate religious beliefs, definitely was talked about in the rhythms and the attitude and the literature of the church, and Coates is not in that at all.
This question actually suggests another to me, which I think is, certainly I think central to our inquiry here. And that is, it kept coming up to me in terms of the museum, for example, of the audience. And obviously a lot of the commentary is about a black audience finding itself in that museum. But it's also one of the, in terms of transformative effects, trying to find a white audience, or at least a broader audience of Americans. And that's been the same problematic, it seems to me, in terms of in the university, of Black Studies courses, African American history courses, or other cultural courses, literature courses, how they reach a larger audience. And what this question suggests to me, you mentioned Coates, but you talk about Baldwin. One could go back to Richard Wright. One could even go back to Frederick Douglass. That the figures who have reached the larger audience historically have been people like that, speaking out of personal, literary, and other kinds of. And so, what does that say to us, or suggest to us, both about our own work as well as in the academy, as well as in terms of the museumship? Because it is a Douglass who reaches and transforms to whatever way it transforms a white audience's ideas about slavery and emancipation in the 19th century. It is Richard Wright, Native Son, whatever its merits or demerits, that really has a powerful impact in that period following the 30s and early 40s. And of course, you talk about Baldwin, you talk about Ellison. I mean, all of these are writers, and this is yet another instance, not of history books, not folks like me, but, and I'm sorry for folks like you, but rather these are the figures who had that transformative effect. So is there something about that? I mean, one, do you agree? And then what can we learn from that in terms of this larger goal that we're all talking about, that the history matters? And it matters only if it gets out of the academy.
Absolutely.
I think that the heroes that you mentioned, and we could certainly add some sheroes, in speaking so authentically of the Black experience, inevitably invite us to have others come forth with their experiences. And it is not to say that in describing, in living, in struggling in an African American experience, that one just cannot wait to be defined as simply human. But it is to say that one is, and that the particularities of one's experiences can be reflected in the experiences of others. I'm thinking of something that Audre Lorde once said. She said, now look, Black teachers have been teaching Shakespeare forever. Why is it that white folk can't teach James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston? And so the point that I'm trying to make is that these great figures in African American history really invited us into a world of duality, a world that was incredibly specific to their own experience, but that always had to be viewed somehow in a larger frame.
Well, I'm not sure that white people take their marching orders from history books either. I think literature moves people in ways that history books don't. Literature is, our books are destined to be supplanted. Historians, we went into a profession that somebody later on is we will be supplanted.
They're sitting right here.
A great novel, because of what novelists can do, they don't have to have footnotes. They can speak to, or memoirs, they don't have to have footnotes. They can speak to the human condition in ways that are much freer than what historians can do. It could be much deeper and so forth, and this is the thing we've chosen. But I understand it's literature, people who are telling their stories that sort of speak to people in ways about the Black condition, white people that maybe history books don't. But I think that's probably true for whites in literature as well.
Well, and it's a great question, Tom, but artists have always gotten places we can't go. It's why Du Bois turned to all sorts of art, even as a historian, including fiction, including poetry. And in Baldwin, Ellison, so many, Toni Morrison in her essays, her nonfiction, critical essays, they all, the great ones all write about this, where they can go that we can't. And I would actually point you to the last paragraph of John Hope Franklin's introduction to this book we mentioned of 1983-4, where I'll just read the last line. This is John Hope Franklin, as careful, brilliant, empirical a historian as you'd ever meet. he ends by saying, I would only add that when one begins a poem, a hymn, a short story, or even a history, one must be optimistic about its completion and about what it seeks to teach. If one believes in the power of his own words and in the words of others, one must also hope and believe that the world will be a better place for having spoken or written those words. We have the same aims as the artist, we just don't have the same method. You know, that's why we should use Baldwin and so many others in the way we consume history. But how many times have you been asked? That metaphor in Toni Morrison's whatever book, is that true? You know, I mean, we're always there. I mean, in the Black Studies department at Amherst College, where I used to teach, my colleagues were always coming to me with, so what did that Dred Scott case say again? I got to refer to it today. You know, my literature colleagues, my philosophy colleagues were always coming to us as though we just have the information. And I got to the point where I said, don't ask me, look it up and read it. You know? So we're always useful, even if we don't have as big an audience.
We need to remember that our new museum is an African American history and culture museum. And there's extraordinary power in that. I mean, we're anticipating the experience of the visual arts, of dance, of music, of poetry, if I may, intersecting with our history. And so this is revolutionary in the sense, one, it is national. Two, it is about history, and it is about culture. And it will always insist, I think, on being understood in a global context.
I would add one more thing, and I'll do it quickly. We invited Adam Sandler and his co-author, who wrote the book on the hip hop anthology, to come to DC, and we invited an audience. We took the Lincoln Theater, and it was, I guess it holds like 400 people, 450 people. When we got there, the place was packed, and they didn't look like you, and they didn't look like me. And on the stage was a DJ, and the music was thumping, and everybody in the audience who looked like you, looked like me, and some who didn't look like you and me were just moving back and forth to the music. When I saw the audience, I said to the programmers, this is the audience that we need to invite to our museum as well. And then last year we had to do this History, Rebellion, and Reconciliation conference. And we did it at the Museum of the American Indian. That holds about 350, 400 people. The entire day, the theater was packed with people. And we had a variety of spokesmen from a variety of genres coming on, talking wordsmiths and poets and photographers and who's the lady who did Selma? Ava DuVernay, she was there, and a variety of folk were there all day long. And at the end, we were congratulating ourselves because the place was packed with 400 folk until the people who were in charge of our social media told us that there were 20 million visits that same day for that conference, in support of that conference. It was then that we understood how we communicate with our audiences needs to change, because social media is huge. It wasn't 7, 8 years ago when we started the museum, but if we don't pay attention to it now, then we are losing an opportunity. So our ability to communicate with a variety of diverse audiences has to necessarily change as the technology has changed as well. And you're right, the stories have to be stories of culture as well as stories of history as well as stories of literature, but the way we deliver those stories have to engage in a realistic way to align with where we are now from a technological standpoint.
Question here?
Hi, I'm Britta Walton-Nelson from the German Historical Institute, and I'm on leave from the University of Munich, where I teach North American and mainly African American history. And I've been majorly inspired by David and by Jim Wharton, who is the Field to Factories exhibit, or he was part of that. It was a great inspiration to me. And so I've been watching the progress of the museum, and since I'm located in Washington, I can see the building grow and grow every day. I'm incredibly excited about it. One question, though, I will have, obviously, since you are dealing with everything, the history, the culture, I mean, we're talking from the first African Americans who came with the Spanish colonists in the 16th century to Black Lives Matter today, it's very obvious that you have to select certain items. And I would be very curious to find out how you, as a commission of advisors and the group at the museum in shaping the programs, what kind of criteria did you have to make these, in my view, incredibly hard choices? Which women and men, which historic evidence, which books, which music pieces to pick and which to leave out? So if you could comment a little bit about these criteria, if there were any, and then I would like each of you to maybe mention something that was most hard for you that's left out, that's not going to be part of the museum.
So the question is about the criteria used to make selections for inclusion in the museum and the tiers of those that had to be left out.
The question about what to include, we, when the museum began, had what we call a Bible of possibilities. And what we had in that Bible of possibilities were what we thought were themes and topics that we wanted to talk about and that we wanted to include in the museum, and that we wanted to find out if we could collect items related to it. Because when we began, there were no collections. There was no, let's go to this repository and pull the collections from this museum or that museum. We had to start from scratch. So much of it related to what we were able to acquire. And thank God we were able to acquire a great number of things that allow us to tell a very, very full history. We also decided very early on, and we knew we could be comprehensive in terms of the history, from pre-contact Africa all the way to the election of Barack Obama. But we also knew that we could not be encyclopedic. And so we focused on those stories that we had evidence of, that allowed us, that we had collections for, and that we thought told a master narrative of the history of African Americans that in some way aligned with the history of America. Because that's what we wanted the museum to be, a lens on what it means to be American. We divided the museum, and then I'm going to stop. We divided the museum into 3 areas. One, history. The History Gallery has slavery and freedom. It has defending freedom and defining freedom, the era of segregation, and it has changing America beyond 1968. That is our master narrative. That tells the master narrative of the entire museum. Second floor deals with what we call community. That's where sports is. As a matter of fact, our sports curator is in the back here. Dr. Damian Thomas is here. And that allows us to talk about not just sports in terms of how the game was changed and how many accolades, but also the social history of sports and how sports also became a way of helping to understand the African American experience in its social milieu as well. There was sports, there's military history there, there is, what else, Damien?
Power of place.
Yes, power of place and making a way. Power of place talks about the power of the spaces and places where African Americans live in the United States, and how those places changed African American perspectives and how African American perspectives changed those places. Places like Oklahoma, places like Florida, places like Philadelphia, places that we felt were important to understand sort of the development of this master narrative that's talked about on that first floor. And then on the 4th floor, we have the cultural gallery. And that gallery has Taking the Stage, it has Musical Crossroads, it has cultural expressions, and it has visual arts. And it is our way of talking about the variety of ways that African Americans expressed themselves. So we've tried to make the museum something that allows us to talk about a variety of things with those as our sort of guiding foci: community, culture, and history.
Hi, Sarah Bowman. I'm at Columbus State University in Georgia. My question is for all of you, but Dr. Gordon-Reed, you mentioned that the episodes of police violence have made certain things visible. And I wonder, as historians, how we can address those for whom these episodes have not made anything visible, for whom things remain invisible. Is it a matter of telling the story of Reconstruction so that the story of the Civil War does not end for the public in 1865? Is it a matter of telling the story of the Civil Rights Movement so that it does not end in 1965? How do you make those choices of emphasis? Is it a matter of, I'm thinking actually about a different story about the Oregon episode in which Native Americans had a press conference leaders and said essentially, you are saying this narrative that it's been taken away from you, whereas actually no, we are the people. So I'm just wondering about ways that historians can make that visible for people for whom these current events are not having that effect.
Well, you mean in the classroom?
Anywhere, in the classroom, or is it a matter of sort of tracking down journalists who have written about this?
I think, well, in the classroom, there are moments to raise these questions. There will be people who are impatient, if I think about my students and some who are, if you're in a history class, to talk about something that's happening, current events. There might be people who object to that kind of thing, but for the most part, my students have not. I've been eager to talk about these kinds of issues and raise them. So I'm not in a place where the students aren't, or sort of generally resistant to this kind of thing, but certainly writing about it. I mean, if you have an opportunity to talk to journalists, to do op-eds, to do whatever, it's a difficult thing because people don't, what do you do with people who don't want to, who don't want to hear this kind of thing? It's just, and you're sort of beating your head against a wall. But for the most part, what happens in my life, in my experience as a teacher, is that there's a moment to draw a parallel or to talk about these matters with students. But I could imagine that there's some places where that would just be not welcome at all. Have you had a problem with this kind of thing?
Well, I appreciate Sarah's my former student, so she's heard me on this before. But this is a story. The African American story is something where you can almost always begin with the present. Almost always.
Yeah.
You could start a course with what's happening on the front page. Now, you don't want to do that for 3 days in a row because you got some history to do. But I really believe that. I mean, there's a currency here. Now, maybe if we were teaching about medieval legal manuscripts, that wouldn't be the case. I don't know. That's always a bad analogy for our poor colleagues in medieval history. But I think the present is always. And by the way, to Britta's question, I mean, what's left out now? I don't know about the exhibitions yet. I've seen scripts, but I can't wait to see the exhibitions, and I'm sure I'll be thrilled with all of it. But I can say that in trying to write a chapter for the book, good Lord, I was given 15,000 words. And anyone's tried to write a textbook, Tom wrote one of the great one-volume books on African American history, and I stole shamelessly from you. But I was to 10,000 words before I got the slave trade finished. So carve all that back, so all kinds of things have to be left out. That's public history. That is. There's a frustration always in public history. And museum exhibits, Rex knows this better than anyone, are not done for us.
Yeah.
They're not done for us. And we always have to remind ourselves of that. I mean, we sort of know that, but we always get angry and annoyed that they didn't do this and they didn't do that. But God, the sports and music sections of this museum are going to be, I mean,
Well,
the whole world's going to want to be there most of the time, you know. Slavery exhibit, well, the students will go there probably.
No,
But that's your task, is you're going to go everywhere, right?
well,
But it's on the first floor.
It's on the first floor, right, by the bathrooms.
They started with an exhibit on slavery at Monticello that was enormously popular, and this whole thing about the captions that were very, very long, that were just sort of reduced to
Too many
nothing.
words.
People were disappointed, but they're not made just for scholars. They're made for. It's a tough question of how to. It's not tough because it can't be done. It's tough in some places where people don't want to do it, and also. It's not just students or other people who might be recalcitrant. Don't you think that there's a split in history about whether or not historians should be out there even talking about the present? I mean, having pretensions to be
public
intellectuals. I mean, you know, it may be obvious to you or me, but but there's a real split. I mean, that your expertise is in the past, and why?
I think less now than it used to be. I mean, you could comment on that.
Well, yeah, what the question raises for me, and I think it's was at the heart of, or part of what I was asking before, which I have no answer for, is how to think about audience. And of course, I think what you're referring to is not an indifferent audience, but a hostile audience. I mean, they may be indifferent, which you may be able to pull in, but people for whom the story you're telling challenges something basic about their own sense of self and location and interest and so forth. Now, I have that on the one hand, which, you know, I don't know what kind of research, or that's not my field to get into that kind of research of what's going on there. And I'm betraying my age, which I probably have to betray it anyway, but I think back when I first started teaching, after finishing in graduate school, teaching a survey course on African American history. And it happened to fall at exactly the same time that Roots came out, which had an unexpected and amazing, television audience. I mean, and now it's probably hard to imagine now because we have so many different ways we get stuff, and no one's sort of sitting there watching at the same time. I mean, it's a tremendous thing, all across the country at the same hour. I don't know what the numbers were, but millions of people, Americans, are turning into this. And, my class filled up. It was a boom. And, I had this feeling, okay, we finally arrived. We're going to get the story out there. Not so much. I mean, within, years that pass, it's up and down. And so I don't want to be pessimistic, but I still wonder just how that dynamic works. That at a certain moment you get millions of people, and admittedly through this medium that has its technological possibilities of gathering them, but also because they're interested. They could have ignored it. It could have been a flop. And people are in conversation about Kunta Kinte and slavery and all that. And then within a decade, certainly, that's faded. And you get, next chapter is the Texas School Board, want to have, a different interpretation of slavery and history of African Americans and Latinos and so forth. And Virginia wanting to have a different, portrayal of the Civil War. And, and you're fighting that battle all over again. That, sometime back in the 1970s, you thought you'd won. That's a downer, but that's the question that bugs me in terms of the reach of the museum, the reach of the media, the reach of our own work. That we keep, like Sisyphus, we keep pushing this boulder up the hill, and then, because I think something else is involved there. It's not a neutral terrain in which one's injecting oneself. I mean, I started out in this business, and I remember Roy Bryce Laporte basically saying, basically we are alienated within the institution. We are in opposition. We are necessarily in opposition. And that's a tension that we still have. So yes, to write an American history, but we're writing it from a point of view and from a perspective that is challenging and transforming that history. And that ain't gonna be simply, an easy road. I'll stop talking. That's my response to you.
There's a question.
Oh yeah, question over here.
So I've heard the term hope from Professor Gordon Reed, revolutionary from Professor Cole. I'm sort of wondering what's significantly different with this museum compared to, say, the number of African American museums that have existed across the country, right? Is it the kind of public square that this might be, as you're talking about, in terms of having Bradley and others have talked about their offices Jews, this kind of work there? Is it the nationalness, right, of it being on National Mall? There's a way in which, I was deeply disappointed at the way the King Memorial was displayed on National Mall, right? That indeed you can walk around this memorial and see very little from those quotes about King talking about poverty or against Vietnam. That if you were on the mothership to flight there and didn't know that King was a reverend, you would know that by going to this monument of King. And so there's a way in which there were many advisors who I deeply respect, and there were tons of things that just got lost that they really should have taught, right? Including the quote that was on his bust, right? So one, I'd like us to talk about sort of what makes this museum distinct. And the sort of second part here is, because I think a lot about money and funding and the necessary financial capital that's sort of required for social movements, but also for movements such as this. And so what's the message, right, when you're looking for donors, when you're talking to individuals, not foundations, sure, that's one thing, but talking to individuals, groups, what's the message? What's the kind of hope? What's the message of revolution that comes when you try to convince folks that this is something that we should support, not just by our bodies, but support, but also with our money. It's critical for the PCC movement. So, two-part question.
I would answer it by saying revolution and rebellion are a part of our story. It is not the story. That we have, Lonnie always calls it a bully pulpit because we're on the National Mall. So it necessarily sort of begs the attention of a larger audience of people. I think also the way that we have looked at African American history in terms of it being a lens through which not just to learn about African American history, but a lens through which to learn about American history. Our assumption is that you cannot, that we, through an African American lens, helps Americans understand what it means to be American, because we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the American experience. And it is that journey that is not a sort of forced march to victory, that is a roller coaster ride that begins, as I said, in pre-contact Africa and goes all the way through the colonial period, all the way through the 19th century, all the way into the 20th century. And all along the way, we try to give voice to the enslaved. We try to give voice to those who are victimized or those whose voices have been unheard. It is not the historians that we see as the only voices that need to be heard there. It is how we reflect the voices of those who went through it in the variety of ways that they spoke and that they talked about it. I think also it is the uniqueness of the collections that we have. As I said, we have somewhere around 35,000 objects. And those objects help us tell a very, very unique story. I don't know anyone else who has Nat Turner's Bible. I don't know anybody else who has George Clinton's Mothership. I don't know anybody else who has a train, so again, Harriet Tubman's shawl. So we have unique items that allow us to tell those stories in a very, very unique kind of way. And then finally, I think we are all aware that this museum becomes in many ways a master narrative that's a part of the National Mall. And that prominence, I think, causes us, gives us a great deal of responsibility to make sure that we tell the story as correctly as possible through the lens of the African American journey.
Let me just, if I may, excuse me. Let me tell you why it's revolutionary, this museum. And I do so by remembering the words of our First Lady, Michelle Obama, at the opening of the Whitney. She said, as a young African-American girl in Chicago, museums for her were white spaces. This museum is a place, yes, out of the African-American experience, but no one should walk in that museum and feel alienated or unwelcomed. This is a museum in contrast to most American museums. I know mostly about visual arts museums, where only 9% of the visitors to American art museums are people of color. In the association that I'm in, the Association of Art Museum Directors, only 5% of museum directors are people of color. And so we all know there's a history of museums in terms of their class and in terms of their white privilege. But on the National Mall, and I'm serious, this is the last piece of real estate, there is a museum that does not reflect being a white space. We haven't talked very much about the educational and the outreach programs of this museum, but they are substantial. It's not just that folk will be welcomed in to look at exhibits, but that there will be outreach into that Washington community, into the DMV as we call it, the district, Maryland and Virginia. And through technology, we can reach out all throughout the nation and the world to begin to help the youngest among us to experience the extraordinary power of feeling respected. So I think there's much about this museum that is revolutionary because it begins now, not back in another era. It can take advantage of so much now that museum professionals know, the use of social media, the inviting of more of a conversation than an instruction. If I sound excited about this museum, I'm going to tell you, it is going to be something else.
Rex, could I remind you that the second part of that question, Quincy's question, was about the realpolitik.
Money.
Funding.
The fundraiser. Well, certainly Rex can speak to it. But you know, this ain't for free to build, but it will be for free to come to. This is $500 million project. Congress has appropriated $250 million, but the other $250 million has to be raised under the leadership of Lonnie Bunch. It's extraordinary to think about this.
I hear from him every week.
All right? And the reason
In all
it's
meetings.
being done is that it's not just the big donors. This museum, more than any museum in the history of museums, has a broad base of members. And it's moving to hear Lonnie and Rex and the other colleagues talk about how they are stopped on the streets, in train stations, in airports, and folk pull out their card and they say, I'm a member of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So that's, again, pretty revolutionary. When the membership, when the ownership is not the big donors who sit on the boards of museums, it's the people who are anticipating, finally, the coming of their museum.
On the money question, just a footnote. Lonnie and others have already been spending it now for years in unprecedented ways. We've been doing for 4 years now a summer institute in public history about African American history at the center I direct at Yale. Lonnie co-funds that with Yale with a substantial amount of money, and we're now, and Damien in fact was part of that. We're now up to, I don't know, almost 100 public historians from all over the country who work in sites that deal with African American experience in one way or another, who come to this kind of boot camp for public. Rex has been there as a speaker, etc. And this is just a one of the many collaborations that we started 4 years ago. And the idea was that the museum is going to need more public historians. And so there's all kinds of those things this museum can do that no previous institution has been able to do because of money.
We have about 4 minutes left.
She's had her hand up a long time.
I missed you.
I did have a question, but more than anything, I want to say thank you for this. I'm super excited about it. I did have a couple comments about the word museum, because as I think about what is being accomplished here, and at this particular moment in time, this is some are calling inflection points in history, and specifically in America. How we think about the word museum, because words are things, and what the potentiality of something like this could be, and just want to challenge us and encourage us as historians to think about what is really the museum, and is the museum what we're going for, or is it something other than that? And specifically at this point in time.
I'll maybe get another question.
Julie Holcomb, Baylor University. And I do want to follow up on the question about outreach. I'm in a community where we have a great deal of poverty, and one of the struggles that we have had in the museum where I work, getting the younger community, particularly the children, the school children, into our museum. And so I was kind of curious about the outreach and how, okay, we can't get our children to Washington, D.C. necessarily, but how's that outreach, maybe, how can that help, I guess, the children in my community, and how maybe that would work?
We have a very extensive education department, and for the last, I guess, 6-7 years, we have had a program. I guess it's the program that I would tout the most. It is a program that we call Saving Our African American Treasures. It's a program that goes into communities all across the nation. It takes it's sort of on the parallel of an Antique Roads show. But we take conservators, we take wood conservators, we take textile conservators, we take historians, curators, we take a variety of preservationists and conservationists with us to communities, and we spend upwards of 3 days there. And we invite the community to come and bring their the memorabilia, the objects that they have that are a part of their family's history or a part of the collections that they've simply collected themselves. And we have them there. We have historians and we have curators talk to them. Experts talk to them about grandma's old framed picture, or great-grandma's doll that she had, or a camera, or some tool that great-granddaddy used to use when he was prospecting for water. A variety of things like that they will bring, and our conservators and specialists will give them not what its value is in terms of money, but what its value is in terms of its history. We will give them some sense of how to take care of it. And we also bring lecturers there to talk about acid-free paper, to talk about how to handle objects, how to store objects. We actually bring a paper conservator there who actually creates a box for whatever the item happens to be that they might have. We then also connect with the community in that we bring the local community agencies there. It could be the Urban League, it could be the NAACP, it could be other museums, but we bring these entities there as well to be a part of the sort of 3 days that we are there. We invite communities to come, we invite schools to come as well, and that's, I think, the program that we do, that we have done the most. And one of the great things I think that Lonnie has done is he has suggested by the programs that we have done prior to the museum opening that we are a museum that exists now. And so there have been a variety of programs that we have done over the years, and all of them have connected to communities in a variety of ways. We have a special love in our hearts for the DC community and for youngsters that are there as well. And so teaching them about race. Matter of fact, there was, interestingly, I don't know if you saw the groundbreaking, but there was two young students from New Jersey who brought in a bag of money, pennies and coins that they had, and they bought them and gave them to Lonnie as his contribution as the school's contribution to the museum. Those are gems for us. It might not have been but $20, but they are gems because they in some way suggest that this museum belongs to them as well. We have a story of a young lady who must have been 12 years old, whose father was on the construction crew of the museum. He bought her one Saturday, and as she looked at the museum, she said to him, "Daddy, have we given any money to this yet?" And he says, "Well, no, they're paying me." She said, "Daddy, we need to give them some money as well," based upon what his daughter wanted him to do. And this was not a black man. This is why he contributed to the museum as well. So what Janetta says about this being a people's museum and people seeing it as a part of their own legacy and as a part of their own patrimony is so very, very important, and that's very, very important to us as well. And finally, I'll say, we have gotten all of these collections because of so many people who have entrusted their treasures to our museum. People who seem to have been waiting for the right institution to come so that they can bring us this old violin, or they can bring us this banjo, or they can bring us whatever it is that happens to be. 60–70% of the objects that have come to our museum have been donations. That says something about the importance of this museum to the community.
Well, that sounds like a good note to end on. It sort of echoes David's beginning note about tragedy becoming hope. And so with that, I'd like to thank our panel for